In 1962, a manuscript was printed. It was not a celebrated publication. There was no formal announcement, no press coverage, and no academic ceremony marking its arrival. It simply appeared, quietly, without attention, and was distributed to a limited number of institutions. The subject matter was scientific. The content documented research gathered from one of the most remote and inhospitable regions on the planet, the polar zone. At that time, polar research was an active field, and documents of this kind were produced with some regularity. So on the surface, this manuscript should have been unremarkable. It should have entered the archival system, been catalogued, and remained accessible to researchers for decades to come. That is how the process was supposed to work. But that is not what happened. Within a relatively short period after the manuscript appeared, it became difficult to find. Not impossible, at least not immediately, but noticeably harder to locate than a document of its type should have been. Researchers who attempted to access it through standard channels found the process strangely unproductive. Some institutions that should have held copies reported that they could not locate them. Others were uncertain whether they had ever received a copy at all. And a few institutions presented a situation that was harder to explain. Their records indicated the manuscript had been received, but the physical copy was simply not there. That detail sounds minor at first. Missing documents are not unusual in large archival systems. Papers get misfiled. Collections are reorganized. Items are occasionally lost during transitions between storage facilities. These things happen, and they are generally understood as administrative imperfections rather than meaningful events. But the pattern here was not isolated to a single institution. It appeared across multiple locations in different countries, within what seemed to be a relatively short and concentrated time frame. That consistency makes the situation harder to dismiss. No public recall was ever issued for this manuscript. If a publication contains errors, or if the research it presents is later found to be flawed, the standard response is to issue a correction, a retraction, or an updated version. Academic and scientific communities have formal processes for handling these situations. Those processes exist precisely because the integrity of the published record matters. But none of those processes were applied here. There was no announcement, no correction, no updated edition. The manuscript did not go through a visible, documented process of withdrawal. It simply became increasingly difficult to access, and at no point did any institution publicly explain why. This raises questions that are not easy to set aside. If the content of the manuscript was found to be inaccurate after printing, there was a clear and established path available. The authors or the publishing institution could have issued a statement. A revised document could have been produced. The original could have been formally recalled with documentation of the reason. None of that happened. And if the research was considered incomplete, not wrong, but unfinished, the same logic applies. An incomplete document can be revised. It can be supplemented. It can be clearly marked as a preliminary report, pending further findings. Again, none of that happened here. At first, it seems like there might be a simple explanation. Perhaps the print run was genuinely small. Perhaps the distribution was always more limited than it appeared, and the low number of surviving copies simply reflects a publication that was never meant to be widely held. This is a reasonable starting point. Small-run academic publications from the early 1960s were not uncommon, and many of them left thin archival footprints simply because they were produced in low quantities and sent only to a narrow group of recipients. If only a few dozen copies were ever made, it would not be surprising for many of them to be untraceable today. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the accounts from that period do not consistently describe this manuscript as an extremely limited internal report. Some of the references to it suggest a distribution that was broader than what would be expected for a purely internal or preliminary document. And if the distribution was broader, the expected archival record should also be broader. More copies in circulation means more acquisition records, more cataloging entries, more institutional traces. A wider distribution should leave a wider trail, not a narrower one. That contradiction is worth sitting with. The silence around this manuscript is also worth examining. When documents are formally withdrawn from circulation, even quietly, they tend to generate some reaction. Librarians note the removal. Researchers who had requested access or been waiting for copies asked what happened. Internal memos are written. Correspondence is exchanged. Even in cases where institutions try to manage a withdrawal discreetly, the process of managing it tends to leave some evidence behind. That is simply how institutions operate. Actions create records, even when those records are not made public. And yet, in the case of this manuscript, even that secondary layer of documentation is largely absent. The correspondence that would typically accompany an administrative removal is not easily found. The internal notes that would explain why copies were pulled or why records were altered are not in the places where such things would normally be stored. It doesn't fully make sense. The absence of the document is one thing, but the absence of the records that should document what happened to the document is a different and more unusual kind of absence. Some believe this points toward a deliberate effort to reduce the visibility of the manuscript, not a formal, announced recall, but a quiet and gradual process of making the document harder to find without ever directly stating that this was being done. Others disagree and argue that the archival record from this period is simply too inconsistent to support that interpretation. They point out that polar research documentation from the early 1960s was often managed informally, that institutions varied widely in their cataloging standards, and that reading deliberate intent into what might be ordinary administrative disorder is a significant interpretive step. Both positions are reasonable, and neither can be confirmed with the evidence currently available. What can be said is that the pattern, the missing copies, the inconsistent records, the absence of any public explanation, the lack of the usual administrative paper trail, is unusual enough to warrant attention. Whether that pattern reflects something intentional or something accidental is one of the central questions that this situation does not yet answer. There is also something worth noting in the way this manuscript is discussed, or more accurately, in the way it is not discussed. Historical gaps sometimes attract significant academic attention. Researchers write about missing documents. Archivists flag inconsistencies. Journalists investigate unusual patterns in the historical record. But this manuscript has not attracted that kind of sustained attention. The number of people who have written about it in detail is small. The number of investigations into its disappearance is smaller still. For a document that raises genuinely unusual questions, the level of scholarly interest has remained remarkably low. That silence is its own kind of observation. It doesn't prove anything. Obscure documents go unexamined all the time, for reasons that have nothing to do with suppression or concealment. Limited interest can simply reflect limited awareness. If few people know a document existed, few people will investigate its absence. But in this case, the manuscript was known to enough institutions to appear in multiple acquisition records. It was not entirely unknown, and yet the questions surrounding its disappearance have largely remained unasked. Whether that reflects oversight or something else is not clear. What makes this situation particularly worth examining is the combination of factors rather than any single element in isolation. A missing document on its own is not a mystery. An inconsistent catalog record on its own is not unusual. The absence of a public explanation on its own can have many unremarkable causes. But when these elements appear together, when the document is missing and the records are inconsistent and no explanation was given, and the secondary documentation is also absent, and the level of inquiry into all of this has remained low, the combination becomes harder to account for with simple explanations. The manuscript came from the polar zone, which in 1962 was not simply a scientific frontier. It was also a geopolitical one. The early 1960s were a period of considerable international tension, and the polar regions were not exempt from that tension. Questions of territorial access, resource potential, and strategic positioning were all active considerations in how polar research was funded, conducted, and published during this period. Scientific findings from polar expeditions did not exist in a vacuum. They existed in a context where certain kinds of information carried significance beyond the purely academic. This does not mean the manuscript's disappearance was connected to any of those broader dynamics, but it does mean that the environment in which the manuscript was produced and distributed was not a simple or neutral one. Documents that might have seemed purely scientific could carry implications that extended into other areas, and institutions operating in that environment sometimes made decisions about publication and distribution that were influenced by considerations beyond scientific completeness alone. Whether any of that applies here remains an open question. What is clear is that something happened to this manuscript that falls outside the normal path of a scientific publication. It was printed, it was distributed, and then it became very difficult to find, without any public explanation of why. The people and institutions that would normally account for that kind of change have not done so. The records that would normally document the process are not where they should be, and the absence of all of this has, for the most part, passed without significant notice or investigation. That combination, the disappearance, the silence, and the lack of inquiry, is what makes this worth looking at carefully. Not because the answer is obvious. It is not. Not because the evidence points clearly in one direction. It does not. But because the pattern of what is missing, and the pattern of what has not been explained, is consistent enough and unusual enough to suggest that something occurred here that has not yet been fully understood. What that something was, and who was responsible for it, and why it was handled the way it was, those questions remain open, and they remain open in a way that suggests the answers, if they exist, have not been made easy to find. When an explanation is offered for the disappearance of the 1962 Polar manuscript, it tends to follow a familiar and relatively simple line of reasoning. The manuscript, according to this explanation, was not an unusual document. It was one of many similar publications produced during a specific period in the history of polar research, a period when scientific interest in Arctic and Antarctic territories was high, international expeditions were frequent, and the volume of published material coming out of those expeditions was considerable. In that context, the argument goes, a document that is now difficult to find is not necessarily a document that was deliberately hidden. It may simply be a document that was always limited in reach, and that over time, like many such documents, quietly faded from the accessible record. This explanation has a certain logic to it, and to understand why it is considered reasonable, it helps to understand what polar research looked like during this particular era. The late 1950s and early 1960s were an unusually active time for scientific work in the polar regions. A major driver of this activity was the International Geophysical Year, which ran from 1957 to 1958 and brought together researchers from dozens of nations to conduct coordinated studies across multiple fields. The polar zones were a central focus of that effort. Stations were established, expeditions were launched, and data was gathered on a wide range of phenomena: ice depth and movement, atmospheric pressure and composition, magnetic field variations, temperature fluctuations across seasons. It was, by any measure, a concentrated period of polar scientific activity. That activity did not stop when the International Geophysical Year ended. Many of the nations that had participated continued their polar programs well into the 1960s, building on the data collected during the shared initiative and pursuing new lines of research independently. The result was a sustained output of scientific documentation, reports, datasets, preliminary findings, and more formal publications that came from stations and expeditions spread across some of the most remote geography on Earth. This was the environment in which the 1962 manuscript was produced. And within that environment, a publication with limited distribution was not an exception. It was the norm. Publications from polar expeditions during this period were often printed in small batches. This was not unusual or secretive. It was simply practical. The audience for highly specialized polar research data was not large. The institutions that needed access to such material were specific and relatively few. Printing thousands of copies of a document that would only be used by a handful of research stations, university departments, and government science bodies would have been wasteful. So publications were produced in quantities matched to their expected readership. Sometimes that meant a few hundred copies, sometimes fewer, and sometimes those copies went only to a predetermined list of recipients, with no broader public distribution intended at all. Under this framework, the fact that the 1962 manuscript is now difficult to locate becomes much less mysterious. If only a small number of copies were ever produced, and those copies were sent to a limited set of institutions, then over the course of 6 decades, it would not be surprising for many of those copies to have been lost, damaged, misfiled, or simply discarded during collection reorganizations. Libraries regularly deaccession materials they consider outdated or outside their current collecting scope. Research institutions go through reorganizations that result in older materials being moved, consolidated, or in some cases disposed of. Time alone accounts for a significant amount of archival attrition. By this reasoning, a missing polar document from 1962 is not a puzzle requiring a special explanation. It is simply what happens to small-run scientific publications over long periods of time. Some researchers who have looked at this period also point to a second factor, one that is slightly more specific, but still falls within the range of routine administrative explanation. In the early 1960s, several national science bodies were actively reorganizing how they categorized and stored polar research materials. The International Geophysical Year had produced an enormous volume of data, and the years that followed involved significant effort to classify, archive, and in some cases consolidate that material. During this process, documents that had been circulating in one form were sometimes pulled back and reclassified. They were not destroyed. They were relocated, moved from general circulation into more specialized or restricted archival categories, where access required more specific authorization or more direct institutional contact. This kind of internal archiving is not the same as deliberate removal. The distinction matters. A document that has been reclassified and moved to a restricted archive is still, in principle, accessible. It has not been erased, but it has become harder to find through standard channels. And if the record of its reclassification was itself maintained informally, which, during this period, was not uncommon, then the practical result could look, from the outside, very much like disappearance. The document is not where it used to be. The record does not clearly explain where it went, and someone trying to locate it through normal archival processes finds nothing. This is the explanation that is most frequently offered when the question of the manuscript's disappearance is raised. It is calm. It is logical. It fits within a broader pattern of how polar research documentation was handled during this period. And on the surface, it does answer the question in a satisfying way. It removes the need for any unusual interpretation. It places the manuscript's absence within a context of ordinary administrative and archival processes that were affecting many documents at the same time. It makes the situation unremarkable, which is perhaps its greatest appeal as an explanation. At first, it seems entirely sufficient. But there's a problem. The explanation works well as a general account of what happened to polar research documents during this era. It is accurate that many such documents had limited print runs. It is accurate that administrative reorganizations pulled some materials from general circulation. It is accurate that archival attrition over 60 years accounts for a great deal of what is no longer easily findable. All of that is true and reasonable. But a general explanation is not the same as a specific one, and when the specific details of this manuscript are examined more closely, the general explanation begins to show gaps that it does not fully address. The first gap involves the distribution pattern. If this manuscript followed the standard model for polar research publications of its time, its distribution should have been consistent with that model. A small print run sent to a predictable list of recipients would leave a predictable kind of archival footprint, thin but consistent. The institutions that received copies would have records of receiving them. The institutions that did not receive copies would simply have no record at all. What would not be expected is a situation where institutions have records suggesting receipt, but cannot produce the physical copy. That second situation is different from simple limited distribution. It suggests something happened after the document arrived, not before. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because the accounts connected to this manuscript do not describe a uniform pattern of absence. They describe an uneven one. Some institutions have no record and no copy, which fits the limited distribution model, but others have records without copies, and that inconsistency is not something the standard explanation accounts for cleanly. It introduces a category of absence that goes beyond what would be expected from a small print run and normal archival attrition. The second gap involves the timeline. Administrative reorganizations of the kind described, where documents were pulled from general circulation and reclassified, did happen during this period. But those processes were generally documented. Institutions that reclassified materials maintained records of what was moved, when, and under what authority. Those records may not always be easy to find, but they exist as a category of evidence that should be traceable in principle. In this case, that category of evidence is also largely absent. The reorganization that would explain the manuscript's reclassification has not been documented in any source currently available. Its existence, if it happened, is assumed rather than confirmed. That distinction is worth sitting with for a moment. An explanation that relies on an undocumented process is not the same as an explanation that relies on a documented one. The logic of the explanation may be sound. Such reorganizations did happen, and one could have affected this manuscript. But without documentation, it remains a plausible possibility rather than a confirmed account. And plausible possibilities, when stacked together, are not the same as established facts. This raises questions about how much explanatory weight should be placed on a framework that cannot currently be verified through direct evidence. Some researchers accept this limitation and still find the standard explanation more persuasive than any alternative. They argue that the absence of documentation for the reorganization is itself consistent with how informally some of these processes were managed at the time. They point out that expecting detailed records of every archival decision made in the early 1960s may be unrealistic, and that the absence of those records does not mean the decisions were not made. This is a fair point. It doesn't fully make sense to assume that every absence of documentation implies something unusual. Incomplete records are a feature of history, not an exception. Others disagree. They argue that the specific pattern of absence in this case, affecting not just the physical document, but also the secondary records that would accompany a routine administrative action, is unusual enough to suggest that something beyond routine administration occurred. They note that other documents from the same period and the same institutions do not show the same pattern, which makes it harder to attribute the gaps to general era-wide record-keeping informality. Both positions are reasonable, and neither can be resolved with the evidence currently available. What can be said with some confidence is that the standard explanation is not as complete as it initially appears. It addresses the general context well. It explains why many polar documents from this era have thin archival footprints, but does not fully explain why this particular manuscript's footprint has the specific shape it does. With the uneven distribution pattern, the records without copies, and the absence of the documentation that would accompany a formal reclassification, the explanation that is offered is logical and grounded. That should be acknowledged clearly. It is not unreasonable to accept it as a working account of what most likely happened, but a working account is not a complete one, and the gaps that appear when the specific details are examined suggest that the full story of what happened to this manuscript, why it became difficult to find, who made that happen, and under what circumstances, has not yet been fully told. That is where the standard explanation leaves things. Not wrong exactly, but incomplete. And in the space left by that incompleteness, the questions that first drew attention to this manuscript continue to sit unanswered. The first place where the standard explanation begins to show a real problem is not in the content of manuscript, and not in the institutions that received it. It is in something much more basic. It is in the numbers. Specifically, it is in the size of the print run. How many copies of this manuscript were produced? How many should have been distributed? And how many can actually be accounted for today? When those three figures are placed alongside each other, they do not align in the way a simple archival attrition story would predict. And that misalignment is where the first genuine doubt about the official explanation begins to take shape. To understand why the print run matters, it helps to understand what was normal for academic publications of this type during the early 1960s. Scientific reports produced by polar research institutions during this era were not commercial publications. They were not intended for general readership. They were produced for a specific professional audience: government science departments, university research libraries, partner institutions involved in similar work, and in some cases, relevant international bodies that monitored polar research activity. The audience was defined and relatively small, and the print runs reflected that. A typical publication of this kind might produce somewhere between 200 and 500 copies, sometimes slightly fewer, occasionally a little more. but the range was generally consistent, and it was governed by practical considerations, cost, distribution logistics, and the size of the intended recipient list. A print run in that range leaves a predictable kind of archival trace. If 200 to 500 copies of a document were produced and sent to a defined list of institutions, then the expected outcome over 60 years would be a thin but traceable record. Some copies would survive in good condition. Some would be lost to damage or disposal. Some institutions would have maintained their acquisition records carefully, while others would have gaps in their cataloging from this period. The overall picture would be uneven, but it would not be empty. There would be enough surviving copies and enough surviving records to establish that the document existed, where it went, and roughly how it was used. But this is where the situation surrounding the 1962 manuscript diverges from that expected pattern, because the accounts that have emerged from librarians and archivists who were active during this period, or who later examined the records from it, do not describe a distribution that matches the standard small-run model. The descriptions that appear in these accounts suggest a distribution that was somewhat larger than what would be expected for a purely internal or narrowly circulated scientific report. The language used in these accounts is not always precise, but the consistent suggestion is that this manuscript reached a wider set of recipients than the typical polar research publication of its time. That detail sounds minor at first. A slightly larger print run could simply mean a slightly wider professional audience was considered relevant. Perhaps the authors or the publishing institution felt the research had broader implications and distributed it accordingly. That would not be unusual. Some publications from this era were produced in larger quantities specifically because they were intended to reach a broader professional readership, not the general public, but a wider circle within the scientific and governmental communities interested in polar work. A larger print run, in that context, is not suspicious. It is simply a reflection of a decision to distribute more widely. But there is a problem. If the print run was larger than the standard model, the archival trace should also be larger. This is not a complicated point. More copies in circulation means more institutions receiving them, more acquisition records being created, more cataloging entries being made, more interlibrary loan requests being generated over the years as researchers attempted to access the document. The secondary record, the layer of documentation that exists around a publication rather than in it, should be proportionally larger when the distribution is larger. That is simply how archival systems work. More copies produce more evidence of their own existence. And yet, for this manuscript, the secondary record is not larger. It is thinner than would be expected even for a standard small-run publication. The acquisition records that should document where copies were sent are largely absent. The cataloging entries that would show how libraries processed and stored their copies are inconsistent and in some cases missing entirely. The interlibrary loan records that would show researchers requesting access over the years are not present in the volumes that a wider distribution would predict. The secondary documentation does not match the distribution size that the accounts describe, and that mismatch is not a small detail. It is a structural problem in the story that the standard explanation tells. This raises questions that are difficult to answer within the framework of routine archival attrition. Archival attrition, the gradual loss of physical documents and records over time, is a real and well-understood phenomenon. Documents decay. Storage facilities are reorganized. Materials are discarded during collection reviews. These processes account for a significant amount of what is no longer findable in archival systems. But archival attrition does not operate selectively on secondary records while leaving primary distribution patterns intact. If a document was widely distributed, the secondary record of that distribution tends to be resilient, even when the physical copies are not. Acquisition logs, cataloging entries, purchase orders, correspondence about the document. These things exist in multiple places, created by multiple institutions, and they do not all disappear at once through ordinary attrition. The fact that the secondary record for this manuscript is thin despite accounts suggesting a wider than normal distribution is therefore not something that archival attrition alone can comfortably explain. It introduces a possibility that the standard explanation does not address directly, that the secondary record became thin not because time and ordinary processes eroded it, but because something reduced it more deliberately and more specifically than ordinary processes would produce. Some believe this is precisely what happened. They argue that the pattern, a larger initial distribution followed by a thinner-than-expected secondary record, is consistent with a deliberate effort to reduce the visibility of the manuscript after it had already been distributed. Under this interpretation, the removal was not simply administrative, and it was not simply a matter of limited copies, fading from records over time. It was a more active process, one that involved not just the physical copies, but also the documentation surrounding them. Others disagree. They argue that record-keeping within polar research institutions during this period was inconsistently maintained across the board, and that the thin secondary record for this manuscript is not evidence of selective removal, but simply evidence of generally poor documentation practices. They point out that many institutions handling polar research materials in the early 1960s were operating with limited administrative resources, that cataloging standards varied widely, and that expecting a consistent and complete secondary record from this environment may be an unrealistic standard to apply. This counter-argument has some validity. It is true that documentation practices in this period were not uniform. It is true that some institutions maintained detailed records, while others kept almost none. And it is true that applying modern archival expectations to a 60-year-old collection of polar research documents from a politically and administratively complex era involves a degree of interpretive caution. The thin secondary record could reflect these general conditions rather than anything specific to this manuscript. However, the problem with this counterargument is the same problem that appears throughout the standard explanation. It works as a general account, but struggles as a specific one. If poor documentation practices explain the thin secondary record for this manuscript, those same practices should produce similarly thin records for other publications from the same institutions and the same period. And this is where a comparison becomes relevant. Other polar research documents from this era, documents produced by the same or closely related institutions, distributed through the same channels, during the same administrative period, do not uniformly show the same thin secondary record. Some of them are well documented. Their acquisition histories are traceable. Their cataloging entries exist in multiple library systems. Their circulation can be followed with reasonable confidence. That comparison matters. It does not prove that the thin record for the 1962 manuscript is the result of something deliberate, but it does make it harder to attribute the thinness entirely to general era-wide documentation problems. If those problems were systemic and indiscriminate, they should affect all documents from the period similarly. The fact that they appear to affect this manuscript more than comparable documents from the same environment reintroduces the question of whether something specific happened here, something that went beyond what ordinary institutional informality would produce. The numbers, as they currently stand, do not add up. A distribution that accounts describe as broader than standard should have produced a secondary record that is at least as robust as, and likely more robust than, what survives for comparable publications. Instead, it produced a secondary record that is thinner. That is an inversion of what the logic of archival documentation would predict. Inversions of this kind are not impossible. Unusual circumstances can produce unusual outcomes, but they require explanation, and the explanations currently available do not fully provide one. What this first problem establishes is not a conclusion. It establishes a doubt, a specific, concrete doubt about the internal consistency of the standard explanation. The standard explanation asks the situation to be understood as a case of limited distribution naturally fading from the record over time. But the accounts describing the distribution suggest it was not as limited as that explanation requires, and the secondary record is not thin in the way that natural fading would predict. It is thin in a way that is slightly too consistent, slightly too specific to this document, and slightly too disconnected from what comparable documents from the same period show. That combination does not answer the question of what happened, but it does clarify why the question is worth asking. The first real doubt in this case is not about dramatic claims or extraordinary interpretations. It is about a much simpler and more grounded observation that the numbers surrounding this manuscript's production and distribution do not behave the way the standard explanation needs them to behave. And when numbers in an archival investigation do not behave as expected, it is usually worth looking more carefully at why. What comes next? When the background and early context of the manuscript are examined in more detail, does not resolve this doubt. In some respects, it deepens it, because the inconsistency in the print run is not the only place where the expected pattern fails to hold. To understand why this manuscript carries the weight it does, it is necessary to step back from the document itself for a moment and look at the environment in which it was created. A document does not exist in isolation. It is produced by people within institutions during a specific historical moment that shapes what gets written, what gets published, and what gets distributed, and to whom. The 1962 manuscript was a product of a very particular moment in the history of polar research, and that moment was not a simple or neutral one. It was a period of transition, of shifting priorities, and of increasing tension between the ideals of open scientific exchange and the practical pressures of national interest and political competition. The story of that moment begins a few years earlier, with an event that fundamentally shaped how the world approached polar research in the late 1950s and beyond. The International Geophysical Year, which ran from July 1957 to December 1958, was one of the largest coordinated scientific efforts ever attempted. It brought together researchers from 67 nations, including countries that were, at the political level, deeply opposed to one another, and focused their collective attention on the study of the Earth's physical systems. The polar regions were central to that effort. Both the Arctic and Antarctic were designated as priority zones, and dozens of research stations were established or expanded specifically to support the program's data collection goals. What made the International Geophysical Year genuinely unusual was the degree of openness it encouraged. In a period defined by Cold War secrecy and national competition, the program operated on a stated principle of shared scientific data. Findings from one nation's stations were, in theory, made available to researchers from other nations. Data on ice formations, magnetic field variations, atmospheric composition, and temperature patterns was gathered simultaneously across multiple stations and pooled into collective databases. For a brief period, the normal boundaries between national science programs were deliberately relaxed in the interest of producing a more complete picture of the planet's polar systems than any single nation could produce alone. That spirit of openness was real, even if it was never complete. There were limits to what was shared and what was withheld. Some data was considered too strategically sensitive to release, even within the framework of an international cooperative program. But compared to what came before and what came after, the International Geophysical Year represented a genuinely unusual moment of scientific collaboration across political dividing lines. The data produced during those 18 months was substantial, and much of it was eventually published in various forms over the years that followed. But this is where the transition begins. When the International Geophysical Year ended in December 1958, the cooperative framework that had supported it did not simply continue. The participating nations did not abandon their polar programs. Most of them expanded them, but they returned, gradually and then more decisively, to operating those programs under national rather than international priorities. The open sharing of data that had characterized the program was replaced by a more selective approach. Some findings continued to be published and made available to the broader scientific community. Others were classified or restricted, held within national science bodies, and made accessible only to those with appropriate clearance or institutional affiliation. And some findings occupied a more ambiguous space, documented in internal reports, distributed to a limited set of recipients, but never formally published in a way that made them part of the open scientific record. This transition did not happen all at once, and it did not happen uniformly across all participating nations. Some countries remained more open in their polar research practices than others. Some institutions within those countries continued to publish relatively freely, while others became more guarded. The result was a landscape of polar research documentation in the early 1960s that was genuinely uneven, some of it open and accessible, some of it restricted, and some of it sitting in an unclear middle space that was neither fully public nor formally classified. The 1962 manuscript appears to have been produced somewhere within that middle space. It was authored by researchers affiliated with the polar station that had been active during the International Geophysical Year, a station that was part of the cooperative data collection effort of that period. But the manuscript itself was not produced during the geophysical year. It appeared several years later, in 1962. That gap in time is one of the first details that invites closer attention. Delays in academic publishing are normal. This is worth stating clearly, because it is true, and it is important not to read more into a publication delay than the evidence supports. Research takes time to analyze. Data requires verification. Authors revise their findings. Institutions review content before approving publication. A gap of several years between the collection of research data and the formal publication of findings based on that data is not, by itself, unusual. It happens regularly in scientific publishing, and it would not typically be considered a reason for concern. However, the timeline here is not simply a matter of a gap between data collection and publication. It is a matter of a gap that places the manuscript's appearance at a very specific moment, a moment when the post-geophysical year transition was well underway, when the openness of that cooperative period had given way to the more selective and nationally controlled approach that characterized polar research in the early 1960s. The manuscript was produced not during the period of open exchange, but after it. And that positioning matters, because it means the manuscript was entering circulation at a time when the rules around what could be distributed and how had already shifted significantly from what they had been when the underlying research was conducted. This raises questions about the process through which the manuscript moved from research to publication. If the data it contained was gathered during the geophysical year, a period of cooperative, openly shared science, and the manuscript was then produced several years later under a different institutional climate, what review processes did it go through before printing? Who approved its distribution? And were the people making those decisions operating under the same assumptions as the researchers who originally gathered the data, or under a newer and more cautious set of guidelines? These questions do not have clear answers in the available record, and that is itself worth noting. A document that went through a standard review and approval process before publication would normally leave some trace of that process: internal correspondence, review committee records, institutional sign-off documentation. For many publications from this period, those traces exist and can be examined. For this manuscript, they are not easily found. The administrative history of how it moved from research to printed document is not clearly documented, which makes it difficult to understand what decisions were made along the way and by whom. At first, the timing of the manuscript's appearance seems like a minor background detail. A publication from 1962 based on research from the late 1950s. That kind of lag was not uncommon, but the timing becomes more significant when it is placed alongside the subsequent disappearance. The manuscript appeared in 1962 and became difficult to find shortly after. That sequence, delayed appearance followed by rapid disappearance, is not a pattern that fits comfortably within the standard model of routine academic publishing. A document that takes years to reach publication and then vanishes from circulation quickly is not behaving the way a straightforward scientific report would be expected to behave. Some believe the delay and the disappearance are connected, that the years between the original research and the 1962 publication were years during which something about the manuscript's content was being reconsidered, reviewed, or negotiated, and that what happened after publication reflects the outcome of that process. Under this interpretation, the manuscript's brief period of circulation was not a failure of distribution, but a brief window before a decision was implemented. Others disagree and argue that reading a deliberate narrative into the coincidence of a publication delay and a subsequent disappearance goes beyond what the evidence supports. Delays happen for many reasons, and so do archival gaps, and connecting the two does not necessarily mean they share a cause. Both positions are reasonable, and neither can be confirmed with the information currently available. But the question of timing does not disappear simply because it cannot be answered. The fact that this manuscript was produced by researchers connected to a major international cooperative program, but appeared years after that program ended and during a period of much tighter national control over polar research information, is a contextual detail that shapes how the rest of the story should be read. It places the manuscript at a specific intersection of scientific history and political history, an intersection where the rules about what could be known and shared were actively being renegotiated. What the International Geophysical Year produced, in terms of data and research, was enormous. What happened to some of that data in the years after the program ended is less clear. The transition from open exchange to selective distribution was not a clean or fully documented process. Some findings moved smoothly from the cooperative framework into the open scientific record. Others moved into restricted archives. And others, perhaps including the findings that eventually appeared in the 1962 manuscript, followed a path that is harder to trace and harder to explain. That difficulty in tracing the path is not simply an archival inconvenience. It is part of what makes the manuscript story worth examining. The environment in which it was created was one where the boundary between what was knowable and what was not was actively being drawn and redrawn. A document produced in that environment by researchers with connections to a major international program, appearing after a significant delay and disappearing shortly after. That combination of factors does not resolve into a simple story. It doesn't fully make sense as a routine case of limited distribution and natural archival attrition. The context is too specific, the timing too particular, and the subsequent disappearance too closely following the appearance for the standard explanation to sit entirely comfortably. What the background and timing of this manuscript establish is not a conclusion about what happened, but a clearer sense of why the question of what happened is a meaningful one. And when the early inconsistencies within the manuscript's own record begin to surface, that background makes them harder to set aside as coincidence. When researchers begin attempting to trace the 1962 polar manuscript through formal archival channels, something becomes apparent fairly quickly. The search does not produce the kind of results that a straightforward archival investigation normally produces. It does not yield a clean trail of acquisition records and cataloging entries that can be followed from the point of distribution to the present day. Instead, it produces something more complicated, a pattern of inconsistency that becomes more noticeable the more carefully it is examined. Not every institution is missing the same thing. Not every gap looks identical. But across multiple national library systems and research archives, a recognizable pattern begins to emerge. And that pattern is what makes this investigation more than a simple case of a misplaced document. To understand why the pattern matters, it is worth understanding how library acquisition records work and why they are considered reliable indicators of a document's history. When a library receives a publication, whether through purchase, exchange, donation, or formal distribution, the standard process involves creating a record of that acquisition. The document is logged, assigned a catalog entry, and integrated into the library's holding system. This process exists for practical reasons. Libraries need to know what they have, where it is stored, and how it can be accessed. But it also creates something with significant historical value, a paper trail that documents not just the library's current holdings, but its holdings at specific points in the past. Older catalog logs, acquisition registers, and processing records can show when a document arrived, who processed it, and how it was classified. These records are not glamorous, but they are among the most reliable forms of documentation available to anyone trying to trace the history of a specific publication. This is why the pattern surrounding the 1962 manuscript is worth examining carefully. When researchers approached national library systems that would normally have been on the distribution list for a polar research publication of this type, they found a range of outcomes. Some institutions showed no record at all, no acquisition log, no catalog entry, no processing record. On its own, this is not particularly alarming. Not every document reaches every institution on a distribution list. Copies get lost in transit. Administrative decisions change which institutions receive which materials. A missing record at a single institution, or even several institutions, could be explained by ordinary distribution failures without much difficulty. But at least two institutions presented a situation that is considerably harder to explain through ordinary means. In these cases, the acquisition record did exist, but only in the earlier version of the catalog. When researchers examined the early cataloging logs from these institutions, the manuscript appeared. It had been received. It had been logged. It had been assigned an entry in the system. That much was clear from the historical record. But when the later, updated versions of the same catalog were examined, versions that should have incorporated and preserved those earlier entries. The manuscript was no longer listed. The entry had been removed. The document that the early log showed as received was absent from the current catalog, with no explanation attached to its disappearance. That is a very different situation from a document that simply never arrived. A document that never arrived leaves a simple absence. A document that arrived, was logged, and then was removed from the catalog leaves something more complicated. It leaves evidence of a process, and that process requires explanation. Something happened between the early log entry and the later catalog. Something caused the record to change. The question is what that something was, and whether it was routine or not. This is where it becomes unclear, because the removal of a record from a library catalog is not something that happens by accident. Library cataloging systems, even the older manual systems used in the early 1960s, and the early computerized systems that began replacing them in later decades, required deliberate human action to modify. An entry does not disappear from a catalog because of passive neglect or the simple passage of time. Someone has to decide that the entry should no longer appear. Someone has to take the specific action of removing it. That action may be entirely justified. There are legitimate reasons to remove catalog entries, and those reasons are well understood within the library and archival profession. But the action itself is never accidental. It is always a decision. The most common legitimate reason for removing a catalog entry is deaccessioning. When a library decides that a particular item is no longer part of its active collection, because it is outdated, because it duplicates other holdings, because the physical copy has been damaged beyond use, or because a collection review has determined it falls outside the library's current scope, the item is deaccessioned. It is removed from the active catalog, and the physical copy is either transferred, sold, donated, or discarded. This is a normal and widely practiced archival process. It happens in libraries around the world on a regular basis, and it is not inherently suspicious. Collections change over time, and deaccessioning is how libraries manage that change. But deaccessioning is not a silent process. It leaves its own documentation. When an item is deaccessioned, the standard practice is to create a record of that decision, noting what was removed, when, under what authority, and what happened to the physical copy. This record serves multiple purposes. It protects the institution from questions about missing items. It provides a clear audit trail for collection management decisions, and it ensures that researchers who encounter the absence of an item in the current catalog can understand why that item is no longer listed. Deaccessioning records are not always easy to find, and they are not always maintained to the same standard across all institutions. But they exist as a category of documentation, and in most professional archival environments, the absence of a deaccessioning record for a removed item would itself be considered a gap requiring explanation. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because in the cases where the 1962 manuscript's catalog entry was found to have disappeared between early logs and later versions, the deaccessioning record that should accompany that removal is also absent. The entry is gone. The physical copy is gone, and the documentation that would explain the removal of both is also gone. Three things are missing where only one, the physical copy, would be expected to be missing in a routine case of archival attrition. That accumulation of absences is not what normal deaccessioning looks like. Some archivists who have examined this situation have described it as unusual, but not impossible. Their position is that institutional record-keeping from this period was inconsistent enough that the absence of deaccessioning documentation should not be treated as conclusive evidence of anything beyond poor administrative practice. They acknowledge that the pattern is irregular, but they place that irregularity within a broader context of imperfect archival management that affected many institutions during the 1960s and 1970s. Under this interpretation, the missing deaccessioning records are gaps in an imperfect system, not evidence of deliberate concealment. Others have been more direct in their assessment. Several archivists with experience in examining historical collection records from this period have described the pattern as inconsistent with normal administrative removal. Their argument is specific. Normal deaccessioning, even when it was handled informally, tends to leave at least some trace. A marginal note in a ledger, a brief entry in a processing log, a reference in an institutional report. The complete absence of any such trace, across multiple institutions for the same document does not fit the profile of routine administrative imperfection. It fits a different profile, one where the removal was not processed through normal institutional channels, or where the documentation of the removal was itself removed along with the original entry. The distinction between these two positions matters considerably. If the missing records are simply a product of error-wide administrative inconsistency, then the pattern surrounding this manuscript, while unusual, does not necessarily indicate anything beyond what was happening to many documents during the same period. It would be an unfortunate archival situation, but not a meaningful one. If, on the other hand, the pattern reflects something more deliberate, a removal that bypassed or was excluded from normal documentation processes, then it suggests that whoever managed the removal of these catalog entries was either operating outside standard institutional procedures or was ensuring that the standard procedures did not apply to this particular case. That second possibility is more difficult to establish with the evidence available. It requires inferring intent from absence, which is always an uncertain interpretive step. Absence of documentation does not prove deliberate action. It is compatible with deliberate action, but it is also compatible with negligence, accident, and institutional disorder. Making a strong claim about intent based on missing records alone would go beyond what the evidence supports, and that caution is important to maintain. However, the caution required in interpreting the evidence does not eliminate the questions that the evidence raises. The pattern that emerges from tracing this manuscript through formal archival channels, some institutions with no record, others with records that existed early and then disappeared, and the absence of the documentation that would explain those disappearances, is not a pattern that resolves comfortably into any single explanation. It is too specific to be entirely accounted for by general archival disorder. It is too consistent across multiple institutions to be easily dismissed as a series of unrelated administrative accidents. And it is too thorough, affecting the primary records, the secondary records, and the deaccessioning records, to look like the ordinary attrition of time. What the pattern does, more than anything else, is establish that the situation surrounding this manuscript is genuinely inconsistent with what normal archival processes produce. It does not establish why that inconsistency exists. It does not identify who is responsible for it. It does not confirm whether the removal was deliberate or accidental, centrally coordinated or locally managed. Those questions remain open, but the inconsistency itself is real. It is documentable, and it is significant enough that the archivists who have examined it most closely have not been able to agree on what it means, which is itself an indication that the situation does not have an obvious or straightforward explanation. That unresolved disagreement among professional observers is where this line of investigation currently rests. The pattern has been identified. Its unusual features have been acknowledged even by those who do not believe it indicates anything deliberately suspicious. And the questions it raises about what happened to these catalog records and why the documentation of their removal is also missing have not been answered. What comes next, when the deeper layers of the manuscript's history are examined, does not simplify this picture. If anything, it adds to it. Up to this point, the questions surrounding the 1962 manuscript have been examined largely in isolation, as if this were a single document with a single unusual history that needed to be understood on its own terms. And taken alone, the pattern of missing copies, inconsistent catalog records, and absent deaccessioning documentation is already difficult to explain through routine archival processes. But there is another layer to this situation that changes the scale of the question considerably, because the 1962 manuscript is not, it turns out, the only polar document from this period that presents this kind of history. It is part of a larger pattern, and when that larger pattern becomes visible, the difficulty of explaining what happened through ordinary institutional processes increases significantly. At least 3 other publications have been identified that share key characteristics with the 1962 manuscript. These are not random documents from unrelated fields or unconnected institutions. They are polar research publications, produced within a similar time frame, connected to overlapping research networks, and affiliated with institutions that had links to the same broader scientific community that produced the 1962 manuscript. In other words, these are documents that exist in the same archival neighborhood. They come from the same general world of polar research activity in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and they show comparable patterns of archival irregularity. The similarities are specific enough to be worth describing carefully. Each of these publications shows a limited number of surviving physical copies, fewer than would be expected given the distribution patterns that can be partially reconstructed from available records. Each shows a thin secondary record, acquisition logs, cataloging entries, and processing documentation that is sparser than comparable publications from the same institutions during the same period. And in at least some of these cases, catalog entries that appear in early records are absent from later versions of the same catalog, without accompanying documentation to explain the change. The pattern that was identified in the case of the 1962 manuscript is not unique to that document. It appears in recognizable form across this small group of related publications. When a pattern appears in a single case, it is reasonable to consider explanations specific to that case. Perhaps that particular document was handled unusually. Perhaps the institution that produced or distributed it had specific administrative problems during that period. Perhaps a series of individual, unconnected accidents produced an outcome that looks unusual but has no single underlying cause. These are all reasonable possibilities when the pattern is isolated, but when the same pattern appears across multiple documents, connected to overlapping networks within the same time frame, the range of plausible single-case explanations narrows considerably. Coincidence becomes a less satisfying account the more times the same coincidence occurs. Some researchers who are aware of this broader pattern have argued that it does not require any special explanation beyond what was already offered for the 1962 manuscript individually. Their position is that polar research documentation from this era was handled informally and inconsistently across the board, and that the archival irregularities visible in these documents simply reflect the general standards, or lack of standards, that apply to this category of material during this period. Under this interpretation, the pattern across multiple documents is not evidence of something deliberate. It is evidence of a research environment that did not prioritize careful documentation, and where the results of that deprioritization are now visible as gaps and inconsistencies in the historical record. This is a reasonable position, and it should be taken seriously. The argument that archival disorder was widespread during this period is not invented. It is grounded in a real understanding of how polar research institutions operated in the early 1960s. Many of these institutions were primarily focused on conducting research, not on maintaining archival standards. Administrative resources were limited, cataloging practices varied, and the long-term preservation of documents was often not a high priority compared to the immediate demands of active research programs. These conditions genuinely could produce the kind of uneven and inconsistent archival record that is now visible. But there is a problem with applying this explanation to the specific pattern under examination here. And the problem is comparative. If the argument is that poor documentation practices explain the archival irregularities in these publications, then those same practices should be visible across the broader output of the same institutions during the same period. Poor practices are not selective. They do not apply carefully to some documents while leaving others unaffected. If the institutions producing these polar research publications were operating with insufficient archival rigor, that rigor should be equally insufficient or equally inconsistent across all of their publications from the same era. And this is where the explanation becomes difficult, because when the archival records of other publications from the same institutions are examined, publications produced during the same period, distributed through the same channels, managed by the same administrative staff, a different picture emerges. Many of those other publications are well documented. Their acquisition histories are traceable through multiple library systems. Their catalog entries are present and consistent across early and later versions. Their secondary records are intact. They behave, in other words, exactly as well-managed archival materials from this period would be expected to behave. That comparison is significant. It means the argument about general era-wide archival disorder does not hold evenly across the documentary record. It holds for some documents specifically, the ones that are now difficult to trace, but not for others that were produced in the same environment under the same conditions. The selectivity of the pattern is what makes it hard to explain through general institutional informality. If the informality were truly general, it would not produce a selective outcome. The fact that it appears to have produced a selective outcome, affecting some documents but not others, suggests that something other than general informality is at work. This raises questions that the available evidence does not answer cleanly. What is it that distinguishes the documents showing archival irregularities from those that do not? Is there a common characteristic that marks the irregular ones as a group? And if such a characteristic exists, does it help explain why their archival histories look the way they do? When the thematic content of the affected documents is examined, to the extent that content can be reconstructed from the partial records and secondary references that survive, a commonality does appear. The documents showing irregular archival histories share a focus on research that was conducted in specific geographical zones within the polar regions. More specifically, they appear to be connected to research that involved certain types of data collection, magnetic anomaly measurements, ice depth surveys, and atmospheric readings from locations that, during this period, carried significance beyond their purely scientific interest. These were locations where the boundary between scientific research and strategic intelligence was, at the time, genuinely unclear. That detail sounds minor at first. Many polar research documents from this period touched on data that had potential strategic implications. The polar regions were of considerable interest to multiple governments during the Cold War, and almost any kind of systematic scientific measurement from those regions could theoretically be considered relevant to national security considerations. So the fact that the affected documents were connected to strategically sensitive zones does not, by itself, prove anything. It could simply reflect the reality that most substantive polar research from this era had some connection to strategically significant areas. However, the combination of the thematic commonality and the archival pattern creates a more specific picture than either element would suggest alone. It is not just that these documents touched on sensitive geographical areas. It is that the documents touching on those specific areas are the ones showing irregular archival histories, while documents from the same institutions, covering less sensitive zones, do not show the same irregularities. The overlap between thematic focus and archival outcome is specific enough to be difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. Some believe this overlap points towards something deliberate, that the documents affected by archival irregularities were identified as a group based on their content and their geographical focus, and that their reduced visibility in the archival record reflects a decision made about that group rather than a series of unconnected administrative accidents. Others disagree strongly, arguing that the overlap is being read retrospectively in a way that imposes a pattern on what are actually independent events. They point out that identifying a commonality among a small group of documents and inferring deliberate intent from that commonality is an interpretive step that requires more evidence than the archival record currently provides. Both positions are reasonable, and neither is currently in a position to claim the evidence as conclusive support. What can be said is that the thematic commonality among the affected documents is real and specific. It is not a vague or widely applicable category, and the selectivity of the archival pattern, visible in these documents but not in comparable ones from the same environment, is also real. Whether those two real observations are connected by a causal explanation, or whether they coincide without sharing a cause, is the question that remains open. At first, it seems like the simplest interpretation is that this is a pattern of collective neglect, a group of documents that were all handled carelessly, for no particular reason, and whose archival histories reflect that carelessness. But there is a problem with leaving it at that. Neglect, as noted, is not selective. It does not consistently fall on documents with a specific thematic focus, while leaving others from the same institution in good order. The shape of this pattern, which documents it affects and which it does not match the shape that general neglect would be expected to produce. What it matches more closely is the shape of a deliberate selection, not proven, not confirmed, but closer in shape to a deliberate selection than to an accident. And that distinction between a shape that resembles neglect and a shape that resembles selection is where this layer of the investigation becomes genuinely difficult to set aside. The 1962 manuscript was already unusual on its own. As one document in a group of documents sharing the same unusual pattern, it becomes part of something larger and harder to explain. And that larger picture, once seen, is not easy to unsee. So far, the questions surrounding the 1962 Polar manuscript have focused primarily on the document itself, on its print run, its distribution, its catalog records, and its place within a broader pattern of archival irregularity affecting similar publications from the same period. Those questions are significant on their own, but when attention shifts from the document to the people connected to it, a different and in some ways more personal dimension of the mystery becomes visible. Because the researchers whose names appear in connection with the 1962 manuscript have their own archival histories. And when those histories are examined alongside the history of the document itself, a pattern emerges that is harder to explain than any of the individual elements would be on their own. The starting point for understanding this dimension of the situation is an important one. The individuals connected to the 1962 manuscript were not minor or peripheral figures in the world of polar research. They were not unknown researchers working at the fringes of the field. Several of them had participated in recognized polar expeditions with documented histories, published findings, and institutional records that can be consulted today. Their names appear in the professional literature of polar science from this period. Their contributions to other projects are acknowledged in institutional records and in the publications that came out of those projects. Their careers, in other words, are traceable. They left a professional record that exists and can be examined. This is an important baseline to establish. When researchers have verified professional histories, when their participation in other projects is documented, when their other publications are accessible, when their names appear consistently in institutional records connected to other work, it means that the archival system was, in principle, capable of recording and preserving their professional activities. The absence of information about a specific project cannot, in these cases, be attributed to the researchers being poorly documented individuals who simply did not leave much of a professional trace. Their traces exist. They are visible in connection with other work. The question is why their connection to this particular manuscript is so much harder to establish than their connection to everything else they were involved in, because that difficulty is real. When early references to the 1962 manuscript are examined, references from the period shortly after it was produced, when it was still in limited circulation, certain researchers are named in connection with it. These references may appear in correspondence, in institutional reports, in the cataloging records of libraries that processed the document, or in the secondary literature that acknowledged its existence during the brief period when it was accessible. In those early references, the connection between these individuals and the manuscript is stated or implied. It is part of the documented record of who produced the work and under what institutional auspices. But when later references to the same work are examined, accounts produced after the manuscript had already become difficult to find. Something has changed. In some cases, researchers who were clearly named in early references are not mentioned in later accounts of the same project. Their names have not been actively discredited or formally removed in any visible way. They have simply become less present in the description of the work. The connection that was documented early has become harder to find in the record that developed afterward. It is not an erasure exactly. It is more like a gradual fading, a process by which the link between these individuals and this specific project became progressively less visible in the sources that someone consulting the record today would be likely to encounter. That detail sounds minor at first. Researchers are sometimes omitted from later accounts of projects they contributed to. Attribution in collaborative scientific work is not always consistent, and the history of science contains many examples of contributions that were inadequately acknowledged or gradually forgotten. This is a real and well-documented phenomenon, and it would be a mistake to treat every instance of incomplete attribution as evidence of something unusual. Omissions happen for many reasons that have nothing to do with deliberate concealment. But this is where it becomes unclear, because the omissions in this case do not appear to follow the patterns that characterize ordinary attribution failures. When a researcher's contribution is forgotten or inadequately acknowledged through ordinary processes, the omission tends to be uneven and inconsistent. Some sources mention them, others do not. The pattern reflects the variable attention and thoroughness of different people writing about the same work at different times. There is no particular logic to which sources include the attribution and which do not. It simply depends on how carefully each source was compiled and what information its author had access to. The pattern in this case is different. The early references, produced when the manuscript was still in circulation and the project was relatively recent, include the researchers' names. The later references, produced after the manuscript had become difficult to find, do not. The temporal structure of the omission is consistent. It is not randomly distributed across sources of different periods. It tracks closely with the broader process by which the manuscript itself became less visible. The researcher's connection to the work fades at roughly the same time and in roughly the same way as the work itself becomes harder to access. That alignment is what makes this more than an ordinary attribution gap. This is where the explanation starts to weaken significantly. If the 1962 manuscript had simply fallen through archival gaps, if it were a case of ordinary attrition affecting a small-run publication with limited distribution, there would be no particular reason for the researcher's connection to it to undergo a parallel process of reduced visibility. Archival attrition affects documents. It does not typically reach into the professional records of the people who produced those documents and selectively reduce their association with specific projects while leaving their other associations intact. Those are two different categories of information, stored in different places, maintained by different institutions, for both to be affected in the same direction, at the same time, affecting the same project, is not what ordinary archival attrition produces. The parallel reduction of the document's visibility and of the researcher's documented connection to it is what suggests something more coordinated than a series of independent accidents. Two things happening separately, each explicable on its own terms, would not necessarily indicate a connection between them, but two things happening in alignment, following the same trajectory, affecting the same subject matter, requires a more integrated explanation. Either the processes that reduced the manuscript's visibility also extended to the people connected to it, or two independent processes happened to produce identical outcomes for the same project at the same time. The second possibility is not impossible, but it is the less parsimonious explanation. Some believe the parallel pattern points toward a deliberate effort, not necessarily a large or formally organized one, but a deliberate effort nonetheless, to reduce the visibility of both the work and the researcher's connection to it. Under this interpretation, what happened to the manuscript and what happened to the professional attribution records surrounding it are not separate events. They are parts of the same process. The goal of that process, under this interpretation, was not to erase the manuscript from history entirely, which would have required a much more comprehensive intervention, but to make it significantly harder to find and to make it harder to trace back to the people who produced it. Others argue that this interpretation goes further than the evidence supports. Their position is that the evidence, while genuinely unusual, is too fragmented and too reliant on inference to support a conclusion about deliberate intent. They acknowledge the parallel between the document's reduced visibility and the researcher's reduced association with it. They acknowledge that this parallel is unusual, but they argue that unusual patterns can arise from coincidental independent causes, and that without more direct evidence of a coordinated action, a decision, a directive, a communication that explicitly connects the two processes, it is not possible to claim with confidence that the parallel reflects deliberate coordination rather than independent coincidence. Both positions are being argued from the same set of facts. That is worth stating clearly. The disagreement is not about what the record shows. It is about how to interpret what the record shows. The facts themselves, that the researchers had documented professional histories in other areas, that their early connection to the manuscript was recorded, that this connection became less visible in later references, and that this reduction paralleled the manuscript's own trajectory, are not seriously disputed by either side of the interpretive debate. What is disputed is what those facts mean. And this is where the investigation reaches a kind of interpretive limit. There is a point in any investigation of this kind where the available evidence supports more than one reading, and where choosing between those readings requires either additional evidence or a willingness to accept uncertainty. The evidence currently available does not resolve the question of whether the parallel reduction in visibility was deliberate or coincidental. It is consistent with both interpretations, and without additional evidence, documentation of a decision, a communication, a directive that explicitly connects what happened to the manuscript with what happened to the researcher's documented association with it, the question cannot be definitively answered. What the evidence does establish is that the pattern is real, that it is unusual, and that it extends beyond the document itself to the people connected to it. That extension is significant. It means the situation surrounding the 1962 manuscript is not simply a case of a document being lost or mismanaged. It is a case where the document and the professional identities of its authors, in relation to this specific project, appear to have undergone a parallel process of becoming harder to trace. Whether that process was natural or managed, accidental or deliberate, remains an open question. But the question is a meaningful one, and the fact that both sides of the debate acknowledge the same unusual pattern while disagreeing only about its cause suggests that the pattern itself is not in doubt. It is the explanation for the pattern that remains, for now, unresolved. Every investigation into a missing document eventually arrives at the same central question, not just where the document went, or who might have managed its disappearance, but what the document actually said, because the how and the why of a removal are almost always connected to the what, to the specific content that made a particular document worth removing in the first place. For routine publications, this question rarely arises. Routine documents disappear for routine reasons, and the content is usually not relevant to understanding why. But when a document's disappearance follows an unusual pattern, when its archival history shows signs of something beyond ordinary attrition, the question of content becomes central. And it is at this point that the investigation into the 1962 Polar manuscript becomes significantly more difficult. The difficulty is straightforward. The manuscript is not available. It cannot be read directly. Whatever the document contained, whatever data it presented, whatever conclusions its authors drew, whatever made it the kind of publication that attracted the attention it apparently attracted, cannot be examined firsthand by anyone attempting to understand its history today. This is not unusual for a document with this kind of archival history. The very process that made the manuscript difficult to find also made its content difficult to assess. What remains is not the document itself, but a collection of references to it, passing mentions in other publications, brief acknowledgments in institutional correspondence, and a small number of second-hand accounts from researchers who reported having encountered it during the period when it was still in limited circulation. These references and accounts are fragmentary. They do not provide a complete picture of the manuscript's content. They were not written as summaries or reviews of the document. They were written for other purposes, and their references to the manuscript are incidental rather than comprehensive. But fragmentary evidence is still evidence, and when the fragments are examined carefully and placed alongside each other, they begin to form a partial picture of what the manuscript contained, partial enough to raise questions, but not complete enough to answer them. The data categories that the manuscript appears to have included are, on the surface, entirely consistent with standard polar research of the period. References in other publications suggest the document contained measurements of ice depth from a specific polar location. This is a common category of polar research data. Ice depth measurements are gathered through drilling or seismic methods and used to understand the structure and age of polar ice sheets. They are scientifically valuable for multiple reasons, and their collection was a routine part of many polar expeditions during this era. They do not, by themselves, suggest anything unusual about the document's content. The manuscript also appears to have included magnetic anomaly readings. Magnetic anomaly data, measurements of variations in the Earth's magnetic field at specific locations, is another standard category of polar research. Magnetic measurements from the polar regions are important for understanding the structure of the Earth's crust, the behavior of the geomagnetic field, and a range of related phenomena. Again, this is not an unusual data category for a polar research publication from this period. Many documents produced during and after the International Geophysical Year included similar measurements. The presence of magnetic anomaly data in the 1962 manuscript does not, on its own, distinguish it from dozens of other publications. Atmospheric observations round out the data categories referenced in connection with the manuscript. Temperature readings, pressure measurements, and related atmospheric data were among the most commonly collected forms of information at polar research stations during this era. Stations that were equipped to gather this data typically produced it continuously, and it formed the basis for a significant portion of the published output from polar programs in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Atmospheric data is scientifically valuable, but also relatively unremarkable as a category of polar research content. Its presence in the manuscript does not help explain why the document attracted attention. At first, then, the content as described through these references seems entirely ordinary. Ice depth, magnetic readings, atmospheric observations. These are the building blocks of standard polar research documentation from this period. If this were the complete picture of what the manuscript contained, the questions surrounding its disappearance would be harder to connect to its content. The argument that routine data collection does not typically attract the kind of attention that appears to have been directed at this document would be difficult to counter. But there is a problem with stopping at the surface description of the data, because several of the secondary references to the manuscript do not describe only the data categories it contained. They describe something else as well, something that the purely descriptive references to measurement types do not capture. These references suggest that the manuscript included interpretive sections, not just data, not just measurements recorded in tables and logs, but sections where the authors moved beyond recording what they had measured and began drawing conclusions from those measurements. Conclusions about what the data meant, what it indicated, what it suggested about the polar environment at the specific location where the research was conducted. This distinction matters considerably. A publication that presents raw data is one kind of document. A publication that presents raw data and then interprets that data, that makes claims about what the measurements indicate, is a different kind of document. The second kind carries more weight and more risk. Raw data can be examined, verified, and assessed by other researchers working in the same field. Interpretive conclusions are more exposed. They stake out a position. They claim that the data means something specific, and if that specific meaning conflicts with the accepted understanding of the field at the time, the interpretation becomes a source of potential controversy in a way that raw data alone typically does not. The secondary references suggest that the interpretive sections of the 1962 manuscript were precisely this kind of problem. They suggest that the conclusions the authors drew from their data were not simply confirmations of existing knowledge or minor refinements of established models. They suggest the conclusions were something more disruptive than that, something that placed the manuscript in tension with the accepted understanding of the specific polar phenomena it was examining. Two of the surviving references make this reasonably clear, even if they do so in language that is frustratingly vague about the specific nature of the conclusions involved. One reference describes the manuscript's conclusions as unexpected given the current understanding. That phrase is worth examining carefully. In scientific publishing, the word unexpected carries specific meaning. It does not mean surprising in a general sense. It means that the finding or conclusion being described does not follow from what the existing body of knowledge in the field would predict. An unexpected finding is one that the current theoretical framework did not anticipate, one that either challenges that framework or requires its modification to accommodate. When a reference describes a manuscript's conclusions as unexpected, it is signaling that those conclusions were not simply adding to the existing picture, but complicating it in some way. The second reference describes the conclusions as inconsistent with the accepted model at the time. This phrase goes slightly further. It does not say the conclusions were merely unexpected. It says they were inconsistent with the accepted model. Inconsistency with an accepted model is a stronger claim than unexpectedness. It suggests not just that the conclusions were surprising, but that they actively conflicted with the framework that the scientific community was using to understand the phenomena in question. A finding that is inconsistent with an accepted model cannot simply be absorbed into the existing picture. It creates a problem for that picture. It forces a choice between accepting the new finding and revising the model, or questioning the finding and defending the model. And this is where the investigation becomes genuinely difficult, because neither of these references explains what the conclusions actually were. They describe the relationship between the conclusions and the existing understanding. Unexpected, inconsistent, but they do not describe the substance of the conclusions themselves. What was unexpected? What was the accepted model that the conclusions conflicted with? What specific claims did the manuscript's authors make about the polar phenomena they had measured? These questions cannot be answered from the available references, because the references do not go that far. They characterize the conclusions without describing them. That absence of specific information is itself worth examining. When researchers who have encountered a document choose to describe its conclusions in relational terms, unexpected, inconsistent, rather than in substantive terms, it raises questions about why. One possibility is that the researchers writing those references did not fully understand the conclusions themselves and were describing their general impression rather than the specific content. Another possibility is that they understood the conclusions, but considered them too technical or too contested to summarize briefly. A third possibility is that something about the conclusions made the researchers cautious about describing them directly, that the sensitivity of the subject matter influenced how they chose to reference it. Any of these possibilities could account for the vague language, but the third possibility is the one that connects most directly to the broader pattern surrounding this manuscript. If the manuscript's conclusions touched on something that was considered sensitive, scientifically, politically, or in some combination of the two, then the vagueness with which those conclusions are referenced in surviving sources may not be accidental. It may reflect a caution that was applied, consciously or not, by the researchers who encountered the document and chose to acknowledge it without describing it in detail. This is not a claim that can be verified from the available evidence. It is an observation about a pattern, specifically the pattern of a document whose archival history shows signs of unusual management, whose author's connection to it was progressively reduced in the professional record, and whose content is referenced in surviving sources only in the vaguest and most relational of terms. Each element of this pattern could, in isolation, have a straightforward explanation, but the elements do not exist in isolation. They exist together in connection with the same document, pointing in the same direction. What the manuscript's content actually said, what conclusions the authors drew, what model they challenged, what the data from that specific polar location was interpreted to mean, remains unknown. The references that survive are careful not to say, and that carefulness, in the context of everything else that surrounds this document, is not easy to set aside as coincidence. It is one more layer of the same pattern, and it is a layer that, like the others, raises more questions than it resolves. When an investigation reaches the point where the available evidence has been examined and the straightforward explanations have been found wanting, what remains is interpretation, not proof, not certainty, but a set of reasoned positions, different ways of reading the same incomplete record that lead to different conclusions about what most likely happened. The case of the 1962 Polar manuscript has reached that point. The archival pattern has been documented. The content, to the extent it can be reconstructed, has been considered. The researchers connected to the document have been examined, and none of the simple explanations, routine archival attrition, general error-wide documentation problems, ordinary administrative decisions, have proven sufficient to account for the full pattern of what is missing and how it went missing. What remains are the interpretations that researchers and archivists have proposed when they have tried to make sense of the case as a whole. There are three principal interpretations that have emerged from those who have looked at this situation most carefully. They are not equally supported by the available evidence, and they do not all lead to the same conclusions about what happened. But each of them is grounded in recognizable historical patterns from the same period, and each of them accounts for at least part of what the evidence shows. Understanding each interpretation on its own terms, what it claims, what it explains, and where it falls short, is necessary before any broader assessment of the case can be attempted. The first interpretation focuses on the political dimension of polar research during this period. Its central claim is that the manuscript contained data that directly contradicted officially accepted measurements from the same polar region, measurements that had been produced by other expeditions, recorded in other publications, and incorporated into the scientific and strategic understanding of the area that was current at the time. Under this interpretation, the problem with the manuscript was not that its data was inaccurate, The problem was that it was accurate in a way that conflicted with an established record that certain institutions or governments had an interest in maintaining. This kind of situation was not without precedent during the Cold War era. The polar regions were not simply scientific frontiers during this period. They were also strategic ones. Questions of territorial access, resource potential, navigational routes, and military positioning all intersected with polar geography in ways that made certain kinds of scientific measurements politically significant. A finding that contradicted the officially accepted picture of a specific polar zone, whether it concerned ice depth, magnetic readings, or some other measurable characteristic, could carry implications that extended well beyond the scientific community. It could affect territorial claims. It could complicate existing agreements. It could create inconvenient questions about measurements that had already been accepted as authoritative. Under this first interpretation, the removal of the manuscript was an act of information management rather than archival routine. The document was withdrawn not because of how it was produced or distributed, but because of what it said, and the associated reduction in the researchers' documented connection to the project. The fading of their names from later references was part of the same management effort. If the document was inconvenient, so too was the clear attribution of its conclusions to specific individuals whose other professional records remained accessible and credible. Reducing both the document's visibility and the clarity of its authorship served the same goal. Some find this interpretation persuasive. It fits within a documented pattern of how politically sensitive scientific information was sometimes handled during the Cold War period, and it provides a coherent reason why the manuscript specifically, rather than comparable publications from the same environment, would have attracted the kind of attention that appears to have been directed at it. Others are more cautious. They point out that demonstrating a political motive requires more than identifying a political context. The early 1960s were politically sensitive in many areas, and not every document produced during that period was subject to political management. Without more specific evidence connecting the manuscript's content to a particular political concern, the political interpretation remains possible but unverified. The second interpretation takes a different approach. Rather than focusing on political implications, it focuses on scientific ones. Its central claim is that the manuscript's interpretive conclusions touched on natural phenomena that, at the time of publication, had no accepted scientific explanation. The data the authors gathered was real. Their measurements were accurate, but what those measurements appeared to indicate, the interpretation they led the authors to develop, described something that the scientific community of 1962 was not prepared to account for within existing theoretical frameworks. This situation, too, has historical parallels. Scientific findings that fall outside existing explanatory frameworks create genuine institutional difficulties. They cannot simply be published and incorporated into the existing literature, because the existing literature has no place for them. They create questions that the field is not yet equipped to answer, and institutions faced with this situation sometimes make a practical decision to withdraw the findings from circulation temporarily, pending further research that might either confirm the conclusions and provide a framework for understanding them, or disprove them and resolve the problem that way. Under this second interpretation, the manuscript was withdrawn not to suppress an inconvenient truth, but to manage an unresolved scientific problem. The institutions involved were not acting to protect political interests. They were acting to protect the integrity of the scientific record, choosing to keep anomalous findings out of the public literature until they could be properly understood and contextualized. This is a more charitable reading of the withdrawal, and it places the responsibility with institutional caution rather than deliberate concealment. But this is where the second interpretation also runs into difficulty, because the further research that would have been the justification for withdrawing the document, the research that was supposed to resolve the anomaly and either confirm or disprove the manuscript's conclusions, does not appear to have been published. If the withdrawal was intended as a temporary measure pending further investigation, the expectation would be that the investigation eventually produced results that entered the public record in some form. The absence of any such publication does not prove that the research was never conducted. It may have been conducted and remained classified, or conducted and never published for other reasons, but the absence is notable, and it means the second interpretation, while coherent as an account of institutional motivation, does not fully resolve the question of what happened next. The third interpretation is the most structurally simple of the three. It proposes that the removal of the manuscript had nothing to do with its content, neither with political implications nor with scientific anomalies. Instead, it locates the cause of the withdrawal in the institutional and professional dynamics surrounding the manuscript's production. Specifically, it proposes that a dispute arose between the researchers who authored the document and the institution that funded their work, and that this dispute resulted in the publication being quietly withdrawn as a consequence of that conflict. Disputes between researchers and funding institutions were not uncommon in this era. The post-geophysical year period saw considerable negotiation and tension over questions of intellectual ownership, publication rights, and the degree to which researchers could publish findings independently of the institutions that had supported their work. Some funding bodies maintained strict control over the publication of results produced under their sponsorship, requiring institutional review and approval before anything could be released. When researchers and institutions disagreed about whether and how findings should be published, the institution often had the practical authority to withdraw or suppress a publication, regardless of the scientific merits of the work. Under this third interpretation, the 1962 manuscript was a casualty of exactly this kind of conflict. The content was not the problem. The process was. The researchers produced a document and distributed it through channels that may not have received proper institutional authorization. The institution discovered this and acted to withdraw the publication, quietly, without public explanation, because public explanations of internal disputes were generally considered more damaging than silent management. The fading of the researcher's connection to the project in later records would, under this interpretation, reflect the institutional preference for not publicly acknowledging the conflict by leaving clear attribution in place. This interpretation has a certain practical appeal. It does not require unusual political circumstances or scientific anomalies to explain the withdrawal. It relies only on a type of institutional conflict that was demonstrably common during this period, and it accounts for the quiet, undocumented nature of the removal. Internal disputes are often managed without formal paper trails precisely to avoid creating a permanent record of the conflict. However, the third interpretation runs into the same problem that limits each of the others when examined closely. It does not fully account for the scope of what is missing. An institutional dispute over publication rights would explain the withdrawal of the physical manuscript from circulation. It might explain why the researchers' names became less prominent in later references connected to the project, but it does not cleanly explain why the catalog records at multiple institutions, records maintained by libraries that were entirely separate from the funding institution, would show the same pattern of early presence and later absence. Libraries do not typically remove catalog entries because of disputes between authors and their funders. Those are institutional matters that do not normally reach into external archival systems. And this is the problem that none of the three interpretations fully resolves. Each of them explains some part of the pattern. Each of them accounts for certain elements of what happened to the manuscript and the records surrounding it. But none of them provides a complete account of why the missing elements are missing in the specific way they are missing, why the pattern extends not just to the document itself, but to the catalog records, the researcher affiliations, the secondary references, and the deaccessioning documentation. The comprehensiveness of the pattern is what each interpretation struggles to fully encompass. Some who have examined this case believe one interpretation is more likely than the others, and arguments have been made in favor of each. Others find elements of all three worth considering, and are reluctant to select a single explanation when the evidence supports more than one reading. Neither position can claim the evidence as decisive support, because the evidence is not decisive. It is suggestive. It points in directions without arriving at destinations. What all three interpretations share, despite their differences, is an acknowledgement that something deliberate occurred, that the manuscript's current inaccessibility and the associated pattern of reduced visibility in surrounding records is not adequately explained by passive processes alone. Whether that deliberate something was politically motivated, institutionally cautious, or the product of an internal professional conflict, each interpretation assumes an active decision was made at some point. what that decision was, who made it, and under what authority it was implemented. Those questions remain, across all three interpretations, without a confirmed answer. And that shared absence of a confirmed answer is itself part of what makes this case worth continued attention. Three different interpretive frameworks, each reasonable within its own terms, each accounting for part of the evidence, and none of them sufficient on its own. That combination does not suggest the case is unsolvable. It suggests the evidence needed to solve it has not yet been found, or has not yet been made available. At the end of any investigation, there comes a point where the evidence that has been gathered must be assessed honestly, not for what it proves, because in this case it does not prove a great deal with certainty, but for what it establishes, what it suggests, and what it leaves unresolved. The investigation into the 1962 Polar manuscript has reached that point. The individual elements of the case have been examined. The archival pattern has been documented. The explanations that have been offered have been considered and tested against the specific details of the situation. And what remains, after all of that examination, is a picture that is clearer in some respects than it was at the beginning, but still significantly incomplete in others. What is clear is that this document existed. It was not a rumor or a misattribution or a confusion with another publication. The early catalog entries, the secondary references in other publications, the accounts from researchers who reported encountering it. These establish, with reasonable confidence, that the 1962 Polar manuscript was a real document that was printed, distributed, and received by institutions that were part of its intended readership. That much is not in doubt. The document existed. It reached recipients. And then, within a relatively short period, it became very difficult to find. What is also clear is that the process by which it became difficult to find was not entirely consistent with what ordinary archival processes would be expected to produce. The pattern of missing physical copies, inconsistent catalog records, absent deaccessioning documentation, reduced researcher attribution, and thin secondary records does not match the profile of a document that simply faded from the accessible record through the normal passage of time and the ordinary imperfections of institutional management. Individual elements of the pattern could be explained through ordinary means, but the combination of elements, the specific way in which multiple categories of evidence are simultaneously reduced across multiple institutions, for this document and for a small group of related publications, does not resolve comfortably into a story of passive attrition. The official explanation that has been offered when any explanation is offered at all, that this was routine archival management during a period of administrative reorganization, is not without foundation. Administrative reorganizations did happen during this period. Documentation practices were inconsistent. Small-run polar research publications did fade from accessible records over time. These are all real and relevant contextual factors. But the official explanation is a general one, and it struggles when applied to the specific details of this case. It does not explain the selectivity of the pattern, why this document and a small group of related ones show the archival irregularities, while comparable documents from the same institutions do not. It does not explain the temporal alignment between the manuscript's reduced visibility and the corresponding reduction in the researcher's documented connection to it. And it does not explain the references in surviving sources to conclusions that are described in relational terms, unexpected, inconsistent with the accepted model, but never described in substantive ones. Each of those unexplained elements is, on its own, a gap. Together, they form something more significant than a collection of individual gaps. They form a pattern of absence that has a specific shape, one that is concentrated around this particular document, this particular group of related publications, and this particular set of researchers, in a way that general explanations do not adequately account for. The shape of the absence is too specific to be comfortably attributed to forces that were affecting all documents from this period equally. And yet, it is important to be careful about what that observation means and does not mean. Identifying a pattern that the official explanation does not fully account for is not the same as proving that something deliberate occurred. It is not the same as establishing that the manuscript was removed because of its content, or that the researcher's attribution was deliberately reduced, or that the catalog records were deliberately altered. These are conclusions that the available evidence suggests are possible, but does not confirm as certain. The distinction between possible and confirmed matters enormously when assessing a case like this one. Some believe the evidence points clearly enough toward deliberate action that the question of whether something intentional occurred is effectively settled, and that what remains is only the question of exactly what form that intention took and who was responsible for implementing it. Under this view, the pattern is too specific and too comprehensive to be coincidental, and the most reasonable interpretation of the available evidence is that the manuscript was actively managed out of the accessible record rather than passively lost from it. Others disagree, and their disagreement is not without basis. They argue that the evidence, while genuinely unusual, is not sufficient to support a conclusion about deliberate intent. They point out that inferring intention from the shape of an absence is an inherently uncertain interpretive move, that absences can look deliberate without being so, and that the history of archival research contains many cases where patterns that appeared significant turned out to have mundane explanations once additional evidence came to light. They argue for caution, for maintaining the possibility that the official explanation, while incomplete, is nevertheless closer to the truth than any of the more deliberate interpretations. Both positions acknowledge the same underlying facts. That is worth restating. The disagreement between those who lean toward a deliberate interpretation and those who counsel caution is not a disagreement about what the record shows. It is a disagreement about how confidently the record can be interpreted, and that kind of disagreement, about confidence rather than facts, is very common in historical investigations where the documentary evidence is incomplete. It does not mean the case is undecidable. It means the case has not yet been decided, because the evidence needed to decide it is not fully available. The manuscript has not been recovered. This is perhaps the most fundamental fact about the current state of the investigation. All of the questions about what the document contained, what conclusions its authors drew, what model those conclusions contradicted, what the data from that specific polar location was interpreted to mean, remain unanswerable for the simple reason that the document itself cannot be read. The references and surviving sources gesture toward the content without describing it. The characterizations that have survived, unexpected, inconsistent with the accepted model, tell something about the relationship between the conclusions and existing knowledge without telling anything about the substance of those conclusions. Until the manuscript is found, or until sources emerge that describe its content more specifically, those questions remain open in the most literal sense. The conclusions described in the surviving references remain undescribed in any substantive way. That absence is significant not only for what it means practically, that the content cannot be assessed, but for what it suggests about how the manuscript was treated even by those who knew of its existence. When researchers who had encountered the document chose to reference it, they chose language that acknowledged its existence and signaled that its conclusions were notable without actually stating what those conclusions were. Whether that choice was deliberate, a form of caution about putting specific details into writing, or simply a reflection of how briefly and incidentally the document was being referenced is unclear. But the consistent vagueness across multiple independent references is harder to attribute entirely to coincidence. The questions that this case raises, about what was documented in the manuscript, about why it became difficult to find, about who made the decisions that produced the archival pattern now visible, and about whether those decisions were connected to the document's content, remain open. They have not been answered by the investigation conducted so far, and they have not been answered by any other investigation into this case that has been made public. They are genuinely open questions, not in the rhetorical sense of questions posed for effect, but in the literal sense of questions to which confirmed answers are not currently available. That openness is itself one of the most notable features of this case. Historical mysteries are not unusual. Documents go missing. Records are incomplete. The past is full of gaps that resist explanation. But most historical mysteries of this kind attract sustained investigative attention over time. Researchers who make it their focus, archivists who work systematically through related collections, institutions that conduct reviews of their own holdings. The gradual accumulation of that attention typically produces, over the course of decades, at least a partial resolution, some additional evidence that shifts the balance of interpretations, some newly discovered source that provides a detail previously missing. This has not happened with the 1962 Polar Manuscript in any publicly visible way. The case remains, as far as can be determined from available sources, in roughly the same state of incomplete resolution that it was in when it first began to attract the limited attention it has received. The questions have been identified. The pattern has been documented by those who have looked closely at it, but the additional evidence that would move the investigation toward a more definitive understanding has not emerged. Whether that evidence exists somewhere in an unexamined archive, or in a restricted collection not yet accessible to independent researchers, or whether it no longer exists at all, that too is unknown. What remains, at the end of this examination, is an honest account of what the available evidence establishes and what it does not. It establishes that a document existed and became difficult to find in a way that ordinary processes do not fully explain. It establishes that the pattern of its reduced visibility extends across multiple categories of documentation and affected not only the document, but the researchers connected to it. It establishes that the surviving references to the document's content suggest the conclusions it contained were notable in their relationship to existing knowledge, without describing those conclusions in any recoverable detail. And it establishes that none of the explanations currently available, the official one or any of the interpretive alternatives, provides a complete and fully coherent account of everything the evidence shows. It does not establish what the manuscript contained. It does not establish whether its removal was deliberate or coincidental. It does not establish who was responsible for the decisions that produced the archival pattern. And it does not establish what happened to the physical copies, the catalog records, the deaccessioning documentation, or the specific archival traces that would normally allow a document of this kind to be found and examined. That is where the investigation currently stands. Not at a resolution, not at a conclusion, but at an honest account of what is known and what is not, and at a clear recognition that the distance between those two things is, in this case, considerable. The most unusual thing about this story is not any single dramatic element within it. It is the accumulated weight of what remains, after serious examination, genuinely and verifiably unknown. Not unknown because no one has looked. Unknown because looking has not yet produced answers. And that distinction between unexplored mystery and examined uncertainty is what makes the question surrounding the 1962 Polar Manuscript worth continuing to ask. Missing physical copies, inconsistent catalog records, absent deaccessioning documentation, reduced researcher attribution, and thin secondary records does not match the profile of a document that simply faded from the accessible record through the normal passage of time and the ordinary imperfections of institutional management. Individual elements of the pattern could be explained through ordinary means, but the combination of elements, the specific way in which multiple categories of evidence are simultaneously reduced across multiple institutions for this document and for a small group of related publications, does not resolve comfortably into a story of passive attrition. The official explanation that has been offered, when any explanation is offered at all, that this was routine archival management during a period of administrative reorganization, is not without foundation. Administrative reorganizations did happen during this period. Documentation practices were inconsistent. Small-run polar research publications did fade from accessible records over time. These are all real and relevant contextual factors, but the official explanation is a general one, and it struggles when applied to the specific details of this case. It does not explain the selectivity of the pattern, why this document and a small group of related ones show the archival irregularities, while comparable documents from the same institutions do not. It does not explain the temporal alignment between the manuscript's reduced visibility and the corresponding reduction in the researcher's documented connection to it. And it does not explain the references in surviving sources to conclusions that are described in relational terms, unexpected, inconsistent with the accepted model, but never described in substantive ones. Each of those unexplained elements is, on its own, a gap. Together, they form something more significant than a collection of individual gaps. They form a pattern of absence that has a specific shape, one that is concentrated around this particular document, this particular group of related publications, and this particular set of researchers, in a way that general explanations do not adequately account for. The shape of the absence is too specific to be comfortably attributed to forces that were affecting all documents from this period equally. And yet, it is important to be careful about what that observation means and does not mean. Identifying a pattern that the official explanation does not fully account for is not the same as proving that something deliberate occurred. It is not the same as establishing that the manuscript was removed because of its content, or that the researcher's attribution was deliberately reduced, or that the catalog records were deliberately altered. These are conclusions that the available evidence suggests are possible, but does not confirm as certain. The distinction between possible and confirmed matters enormously when assessing a case like this one. Some believe the evidence points clearly enough toward deliberate action that the question of whether something intentional occurred is effectively settled, and that what remains is only the question of exactly what form that intention took and who was responsible for implementing it. Under this view, the pattern is too specific and too comprehensive to be coincidental, and the most reasonable interpretation of the available evidence is that the manuscript was actively managed out of the accessible record rather than passively lost from it. Others disagree, and their disagreement is not without basis. They argue that the evidence, while genuinely unusual, is not sufficient to support a conclusion about deliberate intent. They point out that inferring intention from the shape of an absence is an inherently uncertain interpretive move, that absences can look deliberate without being so, and that the history of archival research contains many cases where patterns that appeared significant turned out to have mundane explanations once additional evidence came to light. They argue for caution, for maintaining the possibility that the official explanation, while incomplete, is nevertheless closer to the truth than any of the more deliberate interpretations. Both positions acknowledge the same underlying facts. That is worth restating. The disagreement between those who lean toward a deliberate interpretation and those who counsel caution is not a disagreement about what the record shows. It is a disagreement about how confidently the record can be interpreted. And that kind of disagreement, about confidence rather than facts, is very common in historical investigations where the documentary evidence is incomplete. It does not mean the case is undecidable. It means the case has not yet been decided, because the evidence needed to decide it is not fully available. The manuscript has not been recovered. This is perhaps the most fundamental fact about the current state of the investigation. All of the questions about what the document contained, what conclusions its authors drew, what model those conclusions contradicted, what the data from that specific polar location was interpreted to mean, remain unanswerable for the simple reason that the document itself cannot be read. The references and surviving sources gesture toward the content without describing it. The characterizations that have survived, unexpected, inconsistent with the accepted model, tell something about the relationship between the conclusions and existing knowledge without telling anything about the substance of those conclusions. Until the manuscript is found, or until sources emerge that describe its content more specifically, those questions remain open in the most literal sense.